I would just like to welcome everybody to the first meeting of the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar for this year here in 2025. Before we get started, I just want to do a land acknowledgement here at the University of Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We are very grateful to have this community here today. The spirit of the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar is to gather researchers from across the wellbeing research discipline and across the world, and also specifically to give a place for discussion and community building within sort of the American time zones of well-being researchers. We've taken a new format this year, which we piloted last semester, where we're hosting two mini-series this year, and this is the second of those. Last semester, we focused on the question of the Easterland paradox, and we had speakers present papers on this topic from different points of view. And then at the end of the semester, we had a panel discussion where our speakers returned, and we talked about where we're at on this question, what we know, what's still unsolved, and what what research we need to do in order to build consensus. And that's what we're going to do again this semester, now focusing on youth well-being and its connection to social media and internet access, a pressing issue that we are facing right now in the world. So today, we're going to have David Blanchflower share his very impressive body of work on this topic. And then we will be meeting again on February 11th. That's another Tuesday, same time at noon Eastern time. And we'll be we're going to have the honor of having Michaeline Jensen speak about her work on youth well-being as well. And then on March 11th, we're going to have both of our speakers return and a panel discussion about the state of research as it is and what's next in terms of what are the solutions that are most obvious, what are the unanswered questions that we haven't addressed yet. Without further ado, Chris Barrington-Leigh, professor at McGill University and one of the hosts of the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar, is going to introduce our speaker for the day.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and Sofia and Felix for keeping this great series going. It's my great pleasure to introduce David, or Danny Blanchflower, who is the Bruce V Rauner 1978 Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. Danny is one of the most prolific authors in our field, and he has a long history of contributions in unemployment, recessions, wages, trade unions, aging, as well as in well-being. And those labor economics topics are not even his only expertise in economics. From 2006 to 2009, Danny was an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England and was awarded a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2009. Along with a number of other awards and honorary doctorates that Danny has from London, Leicester, Sussex, and honorary fellowship from Cardiff University. Most recently, Danny has been working on again, prolifically on the topic of today's talk, and I'm not sure he's going to be able to cover everything he'd like to today. But in considerable part to Danny's work and also with his co-author, Professor Alex Bryson of UCL, this is a fast-moving topic, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Danny. Please take it away.
Thank you. As long as you can hear me and I can share my screen. Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. And I think that the whole thing is pretty important. And as background to this, I should say, and I'll explain why, but these papers I'm talking about are essentially briefing papers to a giant UN-sponsored conference at Dartmouth on exactly the question that you are raising for this series, which is what to do about the declining well-being of the young. And basically the UN's coming to Dartmouth, and this is exactly the topic that they're going to think about. And I think the big thing which you just said a minute ago, Anthony, which is really, I think, important, is I don't think, and I'll talk more about it in a second, I don't think we now doubt that we have this problem. I think ultimately we can worry about causes to it, and we can think about social media and so on. But I think the begging question, which we will get to, I suspect, in the next set of meetings, is what the heck do you do about it? And so I think we're going to go there. But let me explain kind of what my thinking is and where this has all gone and why I am where I am. So let's see if we can share that. As long as this is going, we should be able to play from the start. Can everyone see that picture? Anthony, give me a thumbs up if you can see it, Anthony. Okay, great. Okay, so here's the talk, the declining well-being of the young around the world. So I'm struck particularly essentially by what happened in the United States. And I started my focus thinking about this issue there, and you'll see this thing just spread. So here's a piece of data came out a week or two ago from the CDC, basically that 53% of female high school students in the US said they've been sad or hopeless every day for the past 2 weeks. So we have data, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, but this really has taken off. This declining well-being, especially of young women in the United States, took off around 2013. And obviously we can think about what's the timing of it. And in the background, I want you to have in your heads, what I'm going to talk to you about is a phenomenon that's global, started around 2013, disproportionately applies to the young, and in particular, it applies to young women. And it's, we can think of explanations, but that's the fact we got to explain. So let me there's a whole slew of papers. This is literally the papers that we've been writing in the last year or so. And a lot of it really emanated from that paper at the very bottom called Is Happiness U-Shaped Everywhere? And I have that paper in 2021 where I basically showed you what U-shaped happiness everywhere, that you take happiness data or a hump shape in unhappiness, and basically you can show that in the data almost everywhere. And I wrote a series of papers saying this is a great fact in economics, and it's this is something you should sort of listen to. And then I came across work by Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, who started to talk about something else that happened. And I went back and I looked, and I realized that I'd missed something, and the world had missed something, which was that from around 2015, the well-being of the young had started to decline really quickly. Secondly, then we got to COVID, and I assumed, and I got kind of focused on COVID, and I thought, oh, this is all about COVID. And then after COVID, I suddenly realized that actually the changes that you observed in COVID had already started, and they started some years earlier. So paper number 3 at the bottom, these are all Bryson-Blanchflower papers, unless I say otherwise. This is a paper with Xiaowei Zhu and Alex, where we started to think about what does the US look like, what's happened in the US, can we document it? And you'll see in a second that we clearly can document that in US data, particularly from the BRFSS and other things, that this phenomenon had suddenly started to disappear. And I'd written just a little while earlier, wow, this is a great phenomenon, this is really important. And so the first thing you observe is, oh, shoot, it appears in the US to have gone away. So Xiaowei is a PhD student with Alex in the UK, and she had lots of data for the UK. And we said to Xiaowei, well, come in on this. Can you show this to us for the UK? And she showed us this picture, and we went, oh, good Lord. And it looked the same. So basically, we published that paper, and within a kind of a heartbeat, I get a call from the United Nations who said, Danny, do you know about this anywhere else? And I said, well, I'm not sure. I don't know. And they said, we would really like to know if this is just the US or the UK, but what about Canada? What about Australia? But more importantly for us, what about the rest of the world? And so that paper literally sort of burgeoned these sets of papers that you'll see in front of you. And a great deal of it is, as I say, these are briefing papers, and the UN said to us, well, Danny, let's see if this is true. Is this declining well-being that you're going to talk about in a second, is this true elsewhere? And so there's a whole series of papers here with more coming. So there's a paper with Lepinter and Piper where we look at the Come Here survey in Europe, a paper with David Bell when we do it on the UK. In recent times, a paper on Latin America, a paper on Africa. We just had one out on Monday on ex-Soviet states. Jean Twenge and I have one pretty much done on 6 English-speaking countries, including Canada. We have one which is nearly finished, the final one in the series, nearly finished on the Middle East and Asia. And so obviously we're trying to think about what are the patterns in the data. And one just backstop to it, there's a paper which people may well be interested in, which is that I did a lot of work in the past on a data file in the UK called the NCDS. And I realized looking back that there was actually data in it on bullying when you were a child. And I thought to myself, well, maybe we should start to think about what the consequences of this might be. Perhaps this is cyberbullying. Perhaps we can look back and see what the effects of bullying were in the NCDS. So there's data in there from the kids' mothers when they were 7 and when they were 11. And that paper, I think, is a big backstop, which has sort of depressed me forever, which is if you look at where the child was bullied at 7 and 11, and then you track basically everything later, that variable basically has a huge impact on any sort of outcome variables you can think of, including basically the big one is by the age of 55 and 60, are you alive? And so we can show it has effects on all sorts of variables, but that seems like, we can follow those data for 50 years. And so that's the story we're in. So we're trying to look around the world. I'm going to tell you the picture around the world. The picture is somewhat mixed, and a great deal of it is going to end up being now where I am, which is, well, how come some places you see it, some places you don't? What's the story? And that's what you're going to get from me today. A great deal of it, I think, has to do with, it's a lot to do with how the surveys that are being used are taken. And a big part of it, and you'll see something which has kind of emerged in the last week, is that it really matters if this is a web-based survey or a phone-based survey. Remembering that what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to think about the well-being of the young. And I just wrote something literally half an hour ago for this paper, the top one, which is coming, called Not Flourishing. It turns out young people, especially distressed young people, don't answer the phone. They don't make phone calls, and they don't actually answer the phone. And so what happens is if you take telephone, if you take something which is sort of administered by an interviewer, whether it be face-to-face or telephone, you get something pretty different than if you have a self-administered survey. And also understanding that, if you think about panels, a predictor of whether people are trit or not is their happiness level. So in suite 1, the less happy people don't show up to suite 2. But anyway, you'll see that a great deal of the evidence I'm going to talk about rests upon what the survey is, how you do it. But a great deal of the other stuff we're going to talk about is actually there are all kinds of quantitative measures, real world measures, which suggest that the well-being of the young has declined. So here we go. So what we're going to do, as I say, is I'm going to document ill health for the young. First note it with Twenge and height. And eventually, so our first step was not only do we say hump shapes have gone in the US and the UK, I'm going to show you that they've gone in, particularly in those places. And what we are going to end up doing is we have lots of new surveys from 2020. Many of them, including Global Minds and stuff in the US, many of these surveys have not got long time horizons to them. They start in 2020. But if I looked at these countries that they're for in earlier years, I got a U shape. So the question is, once I get to about 2020, what is the data? What is the pattern in the data look like by age from 2020 on? And obviously, do I see a hump shape? Do I see a U shape? What do I see? Basically, the bottom line from this is Blanchflower believes that now well-being rises in age and ill-being declines in age, more or less linearly. Here we go. So here's the first thing that I saw. So this is my measure, how it initially came from a paper with Oswald in the American Journal of Public Health. We defined, so this is 10 million observations in a long time series from the BRFSS. And we defined despair as being the following: basically, over the last 30 days, how many of those 30 days were bad mental health days? A bit more sophisticated than that, but that'll do. And this is the proportion of people who said, every day of my life is a bad mental health day. And this is really scary. And having the back of your head that in the United States today, 10% of 22-year-old women say, every day of my life is a bad mental health day. That scares me. 10%. It's about, and everything I'm going to tell you about in the US, women are always have poorer mental health than men, but all the trends are parallel to each other. So roughly, if I give you a 10% for women, it's 7% for men, and they track. But there you go. Here's the picture. There's the blue line, which was 1993 to 2005. There's the hump shape in despair, peaks around 50 odd. And over time, the whole function basically more or less lifts up in parallel. So the blue line is 93 to 2005. The red line is 2006 to 18. Obviously, you had the Great Recession in the middle. Well, then you get to 2019 to 2024, and that function basically slows down pretty much linearly. And I think what's interesting for people to see is the story that I'm interested in is basically nothing really much has happened from around 48 or so. Everything looks the same. There's no fundamental difference in what's happened. The people who had midlife crises at 50, there they are still, but now the left-hand side of the function lifts. That's my despair story. You can do that in hump shapes in despair. If you take life satisfaction in the BRFS, it's not as good. There's good data for 2005 to 10 bits in the middle, and then 22 and 23. And there's weirdness I've written about the fact there's an early hump in the data because of marriage. But basically, if you do it in life satisfaction, this is a table we're having in Cheung and Blanchflower because we're doing 6 English-speaking countries, one of which being Canada. And obviously, I showed you a moment ago that despair declines in age. Well, happiness now rises in age. That's essentially what I have in my head and what you're going to see in all of these papers and so on. So then the question is, well, what did the US look like? What did the UK look like? That was our first step. And obviously, there's good panel data. So this is the Understanding Society data. And there you can do with GHQ scores. Instead of despair, we define despair in the UK using the GHQ score. It's the worst end of the GHQ score. And basically, you get the same. You get this hump shape around 52, 53 or so. By 2019, 2021, this function slopes down. Okay, so then, and David Bell as well come into the paper on the UK because there are absolute issues which we're going to talk more about. In the UK, the labour force, the annual population survey has for a while now had these 4 questions on life satisfaction, happiness, worthwhileness, and anxiety. And you observe this very clearly again in the anxiety data. And once again, the left-hand side picks up from around 40 or so, nothing much has changed, but it's becoming more or less linear. It's much harder to see that, and the paper on the UK with Bell, it's harder to see that in the happiness data. And you'll see a lot of what we do is in the unhappiness data is all very clear. In many different, I'm going to show you in a minute, in many different measures on the positive affective scale, it's easy to see. It's harder to see in life satisfaction, Cantril, and happiness for a variety of reasons, but I'll show you where I'm going. Okay, so if you just take this for Canada, there's data for Canada, and Garrigay has a set of papers, but there's data for Canada from Statistics Canada that matches it, and you can see a big fall in the proportion of 18 to 34-year-olds who say their mental health is excellent or good, and Garrigay for Canada has it, and as I say, Cheung and I are working on Canadian data, and it'll be out. Cheung's got it. When it comes back from Cheung, we're done, but that's coming shortly. Okay, so then where we're going actually got my ire up, which Janet Curry, who I have been communicating with for nearly a year, we do not see eye to eye on this at all. And a year ago, I tried to explain to her that the position she'd taken wasn't appropriate, but she gave an AEA presidential address last week where she says there is no such thing as a youth mental health crisis. And she claimed that it has a great deal to do with measurement and changes in incentives because of the study that she did in New Jersey. And she doesn't believe that there is a mental health crisis, and doesn't believe that there's a rapid deterioration in children's mental health, doesn't believe in the smartphone stuff. So I thought that was warrant. So this Not Flourishing paper basically takes that on, and we'll see where we're going with this. But I think it's pretty good for you guys to think, well, is this all nonsense, which is what she claims. President of the AAA says this is all nonsense. Unfortunately for her, the evidence is to the contrary. So I went in this paper called Not Flourishing. I decided the first thing I'd do for the United States is I'd take every single data file I could find that exists for the United States, and I'd go through it and say, is she correct? Well, as you see, there are a large number of them there, and I think there are 13, and she's battling over 13. Because in every single one, you have evidence, and I can lay out the details, you have evidence that there's declining well-being of the young on every measure in the United States, no matter what you look at, how you measure it, and it's disproportionately true for women. So that's not a great start for her. The second problem is actually trends in suicide rates have been somewhat slower in moving, but they absolutely clearly, it turns out, do actually track the mental health measures. So anyway, so particularly since 2016 or so, the suicide rates of people under 25 have risen rapidly, and for all the age groups over 25, they've fallen. So this is just one of the pieces of data for you to see. You're going to argue that there's been no rise in mental ill health of people of children in the United States. Well, this is high school students, just out, this 2023 number, just out from the CDC, the number I just quoted to you. And you can see that since about 2011 or so, this thing has just exploded. So more than half of US high school students say that they have feelings of sadness and hopelessness. I have in my head this, and I would happily like people to talk about it. I have in my head that think about Dartmouth or think about McGill, say, or Toronto. It's clear I can show you in all of these data that our students are in deep trouble. One possibility, and it's about solutions, which we'll get to in a bit. One possibility is it's all about what we're doing. It's about what the students at Dartmouth are doing. It's what Barrington-Leigh and Blanchflower are doing. It's something about what's happening at Dartmouth. That's one possibility. And obviously the cure to it will be, well, we have to fix that at Dartmouth. Another possibility is that this happened to these people when they were at high school. And Dartmouth and Toronto and McGill inherited it. And this was something they were scarred when they were 15, and we inherited it. And obviously the issue would be, well, what the solution is going to be about rather different than if than it was the second one. And I don't know which it is, and I don't therefore know what to do. And I'm part of a group at Dartmouth where the president is really big part of her agenda. And I was at a conversation with the board of trustees who said, well, if we gave the person at Dartmouth who's in charge of all the well-being stuff, because I think 1 in 4 people at Dartmouth actually access our mental health facilities. We said, if the board of trustees said, if we gave the Dartmouth $20 million to fix it, what would you spend it on? And the answer is, we don't really know. Okay, so let's just keep going here. So here's this background for the United States. Quite clear that Carrie's clearly wrong, hasn't read the data. I have no idea why she thinks that, but this is a global crisis. So let me tell you about what's happened. Some of us heard my talk at my Morley Gunderson talk at Toronto last year, and now things have moved on from here. So the particular one I'm really quite interested in is, South, so I've got an eye in it. So the first thing, and there are 3 papers, as I said, just come out within the last 2 months. And basically what we've done is we've said, okay, let's think about the story for the United States. Let's go to these countries and see what we can see. And we'll see if we can see the patterns in the data. And in most cases, you'll see we don't see it. Most cases in the raw data, we do not see it, and obviously that's part of the story. So if you start with the Latin American data, these are all Bryson and Blanchflower papers. First, there's all kinds of surveys, the Latino Barometro, Gallup World Poll, and basically you really don't see evidence in those data. They're mostly life satisfaction Cantril data. And in Gallup, obviously, there's a whole series of 1-0 dummies, which eventually Danny Kahneman said should exist and then regretted doing it. We find some evidence for it in Mexico in the Ombier surveys, but basically, we don't really see it in Latino Barometro or in the Gallup World Poll, but we do see it in two things we're going to get to. The first thing we see it in is actually quite interesting for Curry, which is actually we have surveys of the OECD PISA surveys. And you probably know of those as being the surveys that track science, math, and reading scores. And there's a Blanchflower and Cheung paper on this coming too. What we see in these surveys actually is that the 15-year-olds are asked life satisfaction scores and other things. And what you see in these data is we can think about cause and effect. This is a great thing for PhD students because you can get the micro data, and no one's really done this, is that you can actually you can look at the life satisfaction scores in these countries in 2015, 2018, and 2022. And in every single country, I think it's 70 of them, the life satisfaction of the young collapses. So obviously that's a big deal. The second thing, which we've started to do, is I'm now part of and I would encourage people, if they'd like to, write to me, and we'll get them the data. I would like very much for them to come and look at the data. I'm part of a group called Global Minds. And Global Minds is a group that's raised money from around the world and is running internet-based surveys as we speak around the world, has about 2 million observations, And these are internet-based surveys, and they ask all sorts of things. The whole series of variables between suicidality and anxiety and all sorts of things across the world. And basically, when you look at that for Latin America, what you find is that they completely contradict the evidence for the Latino barometers and from the Gallup World Poll. They totally contradict them. In every case, there is strong evidence of declining well-being of the young. So the first thing, you start out in Latin America, the Latino barometers, the Gallup World Poll, the life satisfaction rate, none of that. But your PISA surveys of the young collapse in the Latin American countries, and in all the Latin American countries that are included in Global Minds, same thing. So there's the contradiction. Second contradiction comes when we go to Africa. And again, we have Afrobarometers. We have a whole series of surveys from the UNICEF, from EBRD, the World Values Surveys. And basically, same thing again. You really don't see evidence in these surveys using life satisfaction or in Afrobarometers about standards of living. You still see U-shaped happiness. A bit in South Africa, we have data from the quality of life surveys, but basically you don't see it. But one of the big stories here is that we again, with Global Minds, we have data for Africa for Global, and in every case, in every country, when we take the Global Minds of the internet savvy, remember, this is internet savvy people. When we take surveys of internet savvy people who show up to these surveys, strong evidence in every place of declining well-being of the young. So same story when we get to the ex-Soviet countries. Lots of surveys, European Social Surveys, World Values Survey, EBRD, UNICEF, so on, Life in Transition surveys. You don't see it in those surveys, but when you do get to the Global Minds, then you see it. So obviously the question which the UN has been asking is it real? Why do we see this kind of contradiction going on in the data? How am I doing for time? How much longer have I got, Chris? How much longer have I got?
10 to 15 minutes? 10 minutes?
Perfect. I'm going good. Okay.
10 actually, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, 10, just so sit. Perfect. I'm going well. So the first thing I started to think about was, well, can we explain this? Can we explain why? So if you look at Canada, you've got Australia, you look at New Zealand, you take the Gallup poll, you take all these other polls and you see it. In these other countries, basically you don't. So we started to think about, well, what is it? What is that's going on? So the first thing I got them to do at Global Minds is I said, okay, well, you're collecting a thing called MHQ and various things. Can you just go and collect the Cantril data that's used in the Gallup World Poll and see what happens? So off they go, and it's very good. I say things and they go off and they put it in the survey and we get answers back. We got 25,000 responses back, and the answer is, it looks exactly like MHQ scores and anything else. So we don't think it has anything to do with the nature of the questions. We don't think it's that. Second thing I got people to do was to say, okay, so we would like in places like Africa, where basically there's no access to the internet, can we start to do differential studies, do basic experiments? So basically we got money to go into rural Tanzania. So in Tanzania, we actually, if you take the Global Minds survey, the internet-based savvy people in urban areas, Dar es Salaam and so on, it looks like everywhere. It looks like the United States, ill-being declines in age. So then we went out and just basically did surveys in rural parts of Tanzania where there was little or no access to the internet, and we don't see it. We don't see this declining well-being of the young. We don't see any change in the data at all. It just looks exactly like, it was in the past. No, so where the internet isn't, we don't see any evidence of the stuff that we had. So what's happened in the last week or so is that eventually I managed to get data from the Global Flourishing Study, and I want to show you some things about that in a sec. And essentially what I can show you in that is it really seems to matter how you run this survey. And I'm into right now, I'm looking at papers. I've got a great paper here about Martinez, Hombres, and Kovacic, all about loneliness and about modes of sampling. You'll see that this is really quite something. So here we are. This is what Global Minds has. So Global Minds, basically, for every country, see, there's the list of countries, 77 countries, 1.7 million data points. Global Minds has declining well-being of the young in every one of those countries But the relevance here, of course, is that these are internet savvy. The access to the internet, of course, is rising dramatically over time. And so I've written, and the UN has been collecting data on the spread of the internet, and it's spreading fast across these countries. And so increasingly, you'll see that the availability of the internet is becoming more and more and more common. But let me show you something in this global flourishing survey that I think will presumably astonish you. So here's the survey. Can I explain what this is? So this is Cantril. I'm using Cantril. So this is the global flourishing study, 22 to 24. And let me explain what I've done here. It turns out that this survey is collected in 22 countries in three different ways. Some countries are web only. There's 8 of them. You see them there. So Australia, Germany, Hong Kong, Japan, Spain, Sweden, UK, and USA only use the web to collect data. 14 of them do both. Some of the data in Argentina is collected on the telephone, and some of it's collected on the web. So you can, for each country, right, I can run things. Well, what does it look like if I took the telephone survey for the same group of countries? And what if I take the web survey? So the first thing you see is, this is quite remarkable, sort of got me going on this web story. Look at the survey. So if I throw the 22 countries together and I just run a regression, which has got gender, these age dummies, 18 to 24 being excluded, country dummies, it's also actually got day of interview dummies. It's got like 600 day of interview dummies. And the mode of interview. Okay, so if you look in the 22 countries, there's the old story. There's the decline. There's the U-shape in happiness, declines to around 45 or so, and then picks up. But you see clearly a U-shape in the data for 2022 to 2024, controlling for everything that breathes. So then what we did was, okay, let's pull out the 8 web-only countries. And I know they're selected countries because they're advanced and they've got lots of internet and all the rest of it. So the 8 web countries, and you can do it individually by country, you get these effects. So take the 8 web countries, and what do you get? Well, you get exactly the picture that you get in Global Minds. That's exactly, if I run a regression in Global Minds, that's what I see. I see rising well-being with age. So, so the 55 to 64-year-old is higher. We could talk about how much quantitatively, but let's ignore that for now. We could say, well, how much higher is well-being? And you see well-being rises in age. So now let's go to the other 14. These other 14 do both. So this sample of 14 is the same in column 3 as it is in column 4. So if I take those 14 countries in column 4 and I just take out the data from the web, there it is. There's the rising well-being in age for the 14 countries that are sampled by the web. Oh, so that's exactly, column 2 looks like column 4. But now let's take the telephone sample only. And the telephone sample only has a U-shape. Well, it declines anyway in this set, U-shape, because it minimizes around 50. But basically, the function looks entirely different. So obviously, this is pretty telling, and I've obviously been trying to think about why that is. But obviously, new results out this week, and all these people on Global Flourishing have been writing stuff. But as far as I can tell, they haven't worked out that actually, if you take a telephone survey or take a web survey, you need to worry about all your responses. So obviously, the question now is, well, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that the 2 survey modes matter, and there's a big literature. It turns out that actually suggests that if you do things that, there's various papers here, and I'm reading them like crazy now. It turns out that people find that if you take a survey that involves interview administered, whether it be face-to-face or telephone, then the people are much less prepared to tell you things than they are in self-reported modes of data collection. And so what you see in this literature is that web-based surveys give much higher psychological distress measures than self-reported. And there's a giant literature going back to the 1990s. So we have data here from Australia. We have data from Slovenia. I've got really nice data from around other places showing exactly this. So anyway, so it looks like we've been able to see that, you know, which one of these we believe. I'm trying to think about how I decide which of these things that I believe. I'm going to finish here. But so obviously we've documented ill health around the world. We've documented that the U shape is appearing to disappear. Patterns around the world are clearer. It turns out, I'm talking more about it if you like, but they're much clearer in negative effect data. Suicide rates are sort of slowly catching. The patterns are especially strong in English-speaking countries. But when you use anything internet-based, you see it entirely. I think, and this is now me having to say what I think the evidence from the web-based surveys suggests that this is a global phenomenon. I mean, in part, the issue, of course, is if it's picking up miserable young people. Why do miserable young people respond to the web? Well, it certainly appears to me that they don't answer the phone. I mean, I remember talking to my president at Dartmouth, who said to me the other day, what you got to remember is that young people are sitting on the phone all the time. But what they're doing is they don't actually make phone calls and they don't receive phone calls and they don't respond to these telephone surveys. So anyway, there we are. Let's go to questions. I think the culprit appears to be smartphones because it appears that internet-related things are a big deal. Access to social media is a big deal. The correlation between the worse you feel, the worse levels of ill health that you have, the higher is your internet access. And times on the internet are a big problem. We've got research going on which suggests the age at which you got access to your smartphone was the biggest deal. But I think I just will stop with one thing, and then we can sort of open it up. Here's the phenomenon. The phenomenon is this thing explodes from around 2012. It appears to be global, appears to have lots to do with the spread of the internet, the spread of the smartphone. It applies disproportionately to the young, applies disproportionately to young women. It's not about labeling. It's not about how we define terms. And if you don't like that, and if you don't believe that, tell me what it is. There you go. Tell me what it is. And I have spent, Gene Twenge and John Haidt and I have been working very hard on this. I have a couple of things on his website on After Babel and Twenge and I working on it. We've worked very hard to try and think, well, if you think it's something different, let's see if we can prove it. I mean, just having in the back of your head, it appears in my data to start amongst 12, 13 and 14-year-olds in the US around 2012. I can't show you that it's driven by the Great Recession. And I've a person who spent a great deal of their lives thinking about the role of unemployment. It seems hard to believe that the recession is really having its impact through 13-year-olds and not through their parents. So I have struggled. Twenge and I have been desperately trying to think of, well, if it ain't that, what is it? Show me empirically what it is that fits my facts. And Danny Boy is struggling. Stop, done. More to come, but Rip, shall I unshare?
Thank you so much. Just to remind those of you who maybe missed the introduction, Danny's coming back in part 3 of this series for a discussion. So so many questions raised here, and this is not the end.
People get back to me because there's more papers coming, and we're desperately. I mean, the world. We want to know. I mean, in a sense, this is a mission to understand what's going on. It's not about point scoring. It's like, okay, the Prime Minister from Lesotho's coming. What are we going to tell him? What are we going to tell him?
So please use the chat or raise your hand, and I will, even if you write your question in the chat, I'll probably ask you whether you want to say it out loud. Let me start off with one clarification. So in the Global Minds and the GFS, what is it that determines the mode of response? Do people get a choice?
The Global Minds, the only form of response is on the internet. And so I can send you that. So basically people can come to this thing and they're given an MHQ score. They actually like this. They come to it, they do this thing over 15 minutes, and then they're given an MHQ score and they're told this MHQ score tells you that you scored 120 and you're doing just fine. And if you scored minus 50, we recommend you do this. So people actually get, if you like, a mental health evaluation, but it's internet driven. So I think what you're observing in Global Minds is something from the internet savvy. Right.
I meant in Tanzania, I suppose, but also
in Tanzania, we simply use the Global Mind survey, and then they basically got a bunch of researchers to go into rural Tanzania and ask questions. I can send you the stuff.
So, but different respondents got face-to-face versus telephone?
Correct. No. Yeah. Basically, the ones in rural Tanzania were face-to-face.
Okay. All right. And for GFS, there's something, there's telephone or web in those 14 countries. What determines that at the individual level?
Right. And I've actually just done something just to say that. It turns out that in Gallup, I didn't realize, in Gallup, I've done quite a lot of work in the last week or so. In Gallup, it turns out that you can identify, is it face-to-face or is it telephone? And basically, they are no different in any of the. So basically, I show you, if you just think about the evidence by country on what's happened to the young, it doesn't make any difference which one you use. So, I mean, and the literature talks about self-administered against interviewer, right? So if it's on the telephone, there's an interviewer. If it's face-to-face, there's an interviewer. It doesn't look to me on Gallup anyway that there's any difference with it, whether you see it face-to-face. I mean, obviously, there's issues of this. I mean, in the UK, the labour force survey is messed up because in Cantrill, the interviewers couldn't go knock on the doors anymore, and there's all issues like that. But anyway, right.
We have a hand up from Robert. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Cool. Okay, all right, great. So I guess, I really looked a lot at this research, and I really do accept that there is this declining pattern. I guess the problem I have is when it goes from, so it's happening and it's social media. Just yesterday, I was looking at an article on the relative efficacy of psychotherapy and antidepressants for depression, and a psychiatrist named Klein said that there are confounds that are the cause, and Steve Holland, a psychologist, said, well, we've ruled out 50 possible confounds, and he said it's going to be number 51. And he then went on to say, and we just discovered number 51. In other words, the absence of an alternative explanation is really problematic. I noticed there was just a question in chat that kind of fits with this. I mean, have you ruled out how much time they're looking at news, how much time they're actually spending on a computer as opposed to social media, how much time they're spending in video games, et cetera. There's so many other confounds that I see here that it's kind of concerns me, the jump to it's social media. We have to stop social media, when in fact, I know there's also research showing that some people really benefit from social media. So I'm just curious how you respond to it, because I've heard that objection a bunch of times.
Well, I mean, obviously I started out by saying, well, show me empirically. Okay. So all that stuff's all very well. So people are working on it. I mean, obviously there are issues like access to a particular website. I mean, I'll give you actually a piece of data that I quite like, which I've done some things on. It does look like people who have no access to the internet, okay? So let's imagine I split people up into have no access to it at all and don't use it. And then I take people who have a couple of 3 hours a day. Turns out those people are actually pretty happy. They're happier even than people who don't have access to it. And then access time starts to rise fast, right? And it rises amongst these high school students. You see a chunk of women, 10% of women or so, who spend at least 7 hours a day on it. People are thinking about, so the UN is running all sorts of experiments around the world to try and address the issues that you thought about. How much time? What content do you do? I mean, people are working on all of this. No one suggests that, an hour a day looking on your phone to work out where the GPS is a bad deal. But I would add this to you, and I'm of the view it is smartphones. We just have to work out what the basis of it is. The evidence that I really quite like, and I don't like it, but the evidence I like is amongst these. I have various people that I work, particularly at Global Minds, who are neuroscientists, and John Haidt's been into this. And his view is actually, it's not so much of what you're doing on the phone, it's what you're not doing. You're not engaged in constructive play. You're not engaged in various things. And the brain guys are all telling me that they think what's happened is that 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds' brains are forming when they're having social relations with people. And so they think it's what you're not doing. And John's really pushed on that. But I think you're right. There's a nuance to it. and we're working on that. But to say it's they looked at this website or whatever. I mean, I just in a sense that argument is we'll work on it. And the reason I haven't got to tell you a simple explanation is it's complicated, but it has to do with things about the availability of smartphones, because you ain't got anything else that fits my pattern of the data. Starts in 2013, global, hits the young especially. Why does it disproportionately hit the young? Why does it disproportionately hit young women? Labeling things and being access to stuff. Why does that happen? That doesn't fit the data at all. So I think it's sort of what you've said, I'm afraid to be rude, it's sort of fifth order.
Emily, do you want to rephrase your question in light of what you've just heard? Emily had asked in the chat about what do we do?
Well, to be honest, like I did feel like some of my question, Robert covered them in relation to the different screen use, right? So I felt like when Robert talked about like video games or what specific use of the social media people are doing, because I guess that at the beginning of your presentation, Danny, you were talking about like this idea of what do we do once we have the data and the knowledge, right? So I really like that approach. So I was kind of wondering if you have some thoughts in relation to that, right? Like,
I mean, your points are really well taken in that. I mean, for me to say, it's smartphones, right? Well, it's sort of asinine to say that. And then, of course, your point is really well taken. Okay, I say that, but it's much more complex than that, right? Because if it wasn't complex like that, I could give you a fix. The fix is not. I mean, think about Toronto. We can't take the cell phones away from people. We can't. I mean, it might not even be that. So we don't. It's associated with that. We know at this moment that long durations, long amounts of time. If you're a high school kid who's 15 and spends 8 hours a day on the phone, that doesn't look good. Now we don't know quite about content. We think it has to do with cyberbullying. I mean, lots of this research I would encourage people go and look at this new CDC website on the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, which has just come out. And everyone's trying to think about what is it that's really doing the harm. So it's not that we don't think that, it's just we don't exactly know, because some parts of it are really useful. Some parts of it are informational. It does look, two things that I have in my head, which is the really, really long times are bad. Having smartphones when you're young looks to be bad. John's probably right. And the move in Australia and elsewhere to ban the cell phone is a start. But what do I do at Dartmouth? I have the clue what to do. I mean, the original question is right. It's about looking at things and labeling it, but I don't know. So I don't know the answer to that. But we're 15 years in now. That's the problem. Well, 13 years in, and we've stuck with a cohort of people. I mean, the data I just showed you is about current effects of people who are high school students who are 15 today. But I can show you big effects remaining from kids who were 15 in 2013. So we have this rolling cohort of people. Two things. What do we do about the rolling cohort who had it? What do we do about the incoming cohort? And we haven't done anything about either. And this is what we should be talking about. So any suggestions, please, we want to hear them. And the UN wants to hear them.
Let's hear from Ken and then Leona.
Thank you, Chris. Danny, thank you very, very much for a very interesting and insightful presentation. I find your results profound, and I think most people, not necessarily within the academic community, but would agree that smartphones have had a profound yet not fully understood impact, especially in the youth who use them most, who spend most of the time, who grow up with them.
Let me just interject a second. And then the logic to me was, you go to Africa, and half the people in Africa have never in their lives accessed the internet, and you don't see it.
That's right. And I read this last week that Greece is planning to ban the use of smartphones in schools for children under the age of 15. They're basically creating age for digital use of technologies. I don't have much to contribute in terms of furthering the research. The only thing I would suggest is to look at network theory.
Yeah, right.
Because when someone is using a smartphone, they basically move away from the physical human network and
100%.
institutional network
100%.
that they're grown up,
Yeah.
and now enter a completely different digital network of ideas, of sites, of all kind of, so they become estranged from the world they've grown up with. And so anything with network theory and how we affect each other through the networks that we join would be a very interesting line of approach.
Ken, thank you for that. I 100% agree with that.
And I would add a little piece of datum. My daughter, who is 32, going 33, for some reason, never answers the phone when I call her.
Yeah, exactly. Mine either.
When I text her, she does. And I've been scratching my head and even
I have a 38-year-old who does the same. Can I just say something? And maybe Chris, if you think back to a lot of things, what did we learn in economics? And I actually I think what we learned, and then I realized we hadn't learned it. I'll tell you a story. I think we learned about relative things mattering, right? I mean, Paul Krugman once called me and said, Danny, I think you're right about relative things mattering. He said, I can buy whatever I like, but I still care about the salary of my colleagues. Right? Relative things matter, and understanding of who we compare ourselves to is really important. And it may well be, as you rightly say, these phone things end up meaning, instead of, you're my neighbor, instead of me comparing myself to you, I compare myself to Kim Kardashian or something, right? But I do think, I always thought we'd learned something, I just say about the relative things. And I went to the anniversary of of Adam Smith's birth last year. And I went and I started to read the theory of moral sentiment. And on the first 2 pages, he basically says what you just said. He basically says it. He says relative things matter. We care about the well-being of others, and we compare ourselves to others. And I think you may be right that this networking thing and this self might be that we've suddenly got ourselves, people are, instead of comparing themselves to their 2 friends in the classroom, they're comparing themselves to someone in Ghana or something. No, I agree with that. The comparison things are really important, who the role models are, and then can you be cyberbullied, all of that. But it's much more complicated. So I 100% with you. I think relative things matter. And I've always thought that comparison groups are really important, right? Think of what you do as a parent. You try and make sure the comparison group's a good one, not a bad one. And as I said, my daughter will never answer the phone either, and she's 38.
Leona, can I suggest that you ask your question briefly? And I don't think Danny will have time to answer it now, but I think it's important, and we are going to come back, and then Anthony will wrap us up.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I find this incredibly compelling, and I'm going to tap off of something Ken said, because I think in addition to the network effects, they've talked about the displacement, right, of other life-giving activities.
100%.
But the qualitative experience of smartphones and social media. So you can go on TikTok and it'll be like, do you have 5 fingers? You might have OCD, right? And so there are these convincing things, right? That where people, let's say that I've decided to diagnose myself with ADHD. The first time I get distracted, I I've got ADHD, so I can't concentrate. And then I end up behaviorally reinforcing, right? Because we're training our brains 24/7, right? And so if I feel anxious, I diagnose myself with anxiety, and then I recluse from the world even further, which then reinforces or can create an anxiety disorder. So Felix has suggested this. I think she's in the UK. She comes from psychiatry. I'm curious if you have any comments.
Oh, I agree with that. But I mean, in a sense, the question I get to is, what the heck do we do about it, right? I mean, I agree. These self-reinforcing things and people are not, all very important. I don't know what to do about it, and this is something I think we need to study. We need the role of psychologists and others to tell us what to do. But think about, you're the president of wherever, I don't know, let's say Peru, whatever. What are we going to do? How do we control this? Do we, what do we do? And I think that's you're 100% right. And people are taking these things and it's having an impact on, especially on the well-being. I mean, my view is it's 22-year-old young woman, in my view, is the peak of the spear. So I agree with you, but that's our priority. I'm happy. Please send me other questions. Email me if you want to. happily, blanchflower@dartmouth.edu, I will answer, but I got to run.
Yes, thank you so much, Danny. And we have a chance to keep talking about this over our next 2 sessions. So I think this is kind of a nice little segue into our next session on February 11th, where Michaeline Jensen, a psychology professor at UNC Greensboro and an expert in the interaction between youth mental health and digital technology, is going to come and give us a different perspective. Her work is fascinating, and I think we're going to see some interesting things, including, longitudinal results where we don't see digital technology impacting youth mental health. So it's going to complicate the picture, but hopefully also give us some ideas about how we can attack this problem.
But remember, always with policy, the question is, what if you're wrong, or what if I'm wrong? If I'm wrong, what the heck, we've done something about it. If you say there's not a problem and you've not done anything about it, you're in trouble. So it's much better to do something and be wrong than not do something and be wrong. Fine.
That's a great point. So the stakes are high, so we better get it right.
Sir. Yes, sir. Thanks, bye.
All right. Thank you so much, Danny. And
thank you, Danny.
For coming by. And we'll see you on February 11th, second Tuesday of February, and we'll be back at the same time, and then again on March 11th. Thank you all. See you then.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.